Well, hello, and welcome again. This to our 8th series of conversations on the Christian life. This series we entitled In Principio, Erat, Verbum. Remember? In the beginning was the Word. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us as a guest, Katie Leamy. And Katie will tell us, first of all, about herself. Katie,
Thanks.
Welcome. We're so glad to have you here with us today. This is a treat.
Thank you.
Well, tell us a little bit about, I can do this. Tell us a little bit about you.
I'm from Oregon here. I grew up in Sandy. Yep.
In Sandy, I love Sandy.
Yeah. I went back east to Marquette University, got my PhD in theology.
Marquette, okay.
So, I taught moral theology for 10 years, and now I'm teaching English.
Moral theology for 10 years and now English?
Yes, high school.
High school English?
Yes.
I guess it gets better and better. I love this part. Having taught a lot of high school English myself, that's terrific. Oh, excellent. Good. Well, what do you like best about teaching?
I love when students' eyes light up because they get something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when they connect with each other and watching them start to teach each other, I think that's the fun part.
Since we're really talking about the notion of the evolutionary process of morality and ethics, how do you find your students, when you were teaching moral theology, how do you find your students relating to the concept of development of morals?
You know, I read somewhere that there are 30% of people that have an inclination to black and white thinking. They need that. Yeah. And
30%?
I'm not good with numbers, so something like that.
There.
And 60% who are more open to fluidity and ambiguity. Oh, nice. And I think in the classroom, I found it the same way, that there were students who really struggled with the notion of adaptability, ambiguity, change. They wanted things to be cut and dry, simple, black and white, in and out. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's a value to that. I think that when you go too far the other way, you can kind of lose your identity. But I think that the reality of life is we do have to adapt.
We do.
The world is ambiguous.
It is.
So I think we have to hold on to our true identity, which is people called into communion, but also recognize that communion is a living thing. It's always alive, and living things change and grow and adapt.
Very good. Well, since we're going to be talking about Jose Pagola's work, Jesus, and we're going to be talking about it specifically in terms of Jesus's friendship with women, this opens up all kinds of possibilities when you're talking about ethics, morality, and the evolutionary process that, in fact, would lead us to where we are right to this very day. When we first were talking in our very first conversation, the notion of communication by syntactical language became a huge part of what we were discussing. So too in this process of women, we find such disparities over time with the way women are treated and the way men see women and themselves, and the role that women have to step into in order to play that part. Okay? So let me read just the first part of Jose Pagola's chapter on women. He says, many of the poor people around Jesus were women. Those who lacked the protection of a man were certainly the most vulnerable. But in that patriarchal society, all women were destined to a life of inferiority and subjection to men. Is this the will of the compassionate God of whom Jesus spoke? Couldn't women too achieve a life of dignity in God's reign? How does Jesus see and relate to women? What do you think? How is he different than the standard males around him?
Well, I think just to look at the cultural reality of first century Palestine, it reflects a common phenomenon throughout cultural development. When as cultures developed into more centralized cultures with more of a structure, a political and a religious structure, that takes on the need to organize. And one of the frequent organizational strategies is hierarchy. And I think
yes, of course. Yeah.
first century Palestine is a great example, and Pagala describes it so well, of a hierarchical culture where in order to preserve identity and gain stability, some people have to be more important than others. And this Jewish
Just by nature.
Just by nature. And that's part of the cosmology. If we look in the Old Testament, being a member of God's people is participating in order, participating in this hierarchy, a hierarchy of importance, of value, and of purity. So even the camp in the Leviticus and the Deuteronomical text is organized according to importance and purity. Who can be closer to God? And women are always going to be on the outside. If they are included in the life of the community, it's because of their relationship to a man. If they're able to worship God, it's because of the benefit that they bring to a man. It's through the mediation of the man that they are the people of Israel as well. So Jesus comes into this world where women have very little, if any, place in what it means, that identity of being God's people.
Well, of course, as you well know, a woman really did not have her own person. She belonged to her father. And her father, he could do whatever he wanted. This even goes back to the old Romans with the paterfamilias, I'm the father, I can do whatever I want. And then when she married, she didn't become her own woman, she was handed over to her husband. Always some guy was in charge.
Yep.
Do we see anything similar to that in our society today, you think?
Yeah, anytime we have a part of our culture that is hierarchical, that is that values tradition over participation, I think you're going to find people who are systematically excluded, and that there will always be a justification about the exclusion that relates to purity, identity. Somehow this person is not fully human. Somehow this person is not fully included, but that's part of God's order. So whenever you see that idea of order and hierarchy, you're going to find people outside, whether that's because of gender or race or disability or anything else.
Well, you keep talking about purity. What does that mean?
So in the Old Testament, this concept of holiness that I think you've talked about is you have to maintain your purity from contamination. Contamination can be simple, like mold or disease. Or it can be physical impurity. It can be ritual impurity. So violating one of the cultural norms like eating pork, or can be spiritual impurity. Associating with someone who isn't an Israelite, doing business with them, violating the Sabbath.
Well, and women by their very nature, of course, are going to have places that were considered impure, whether she's in her menstrual cycle, whether she's just given childbirth. Automatically, she's impure. She can't be associated with it.
So women spent most of their lives being impure.
Yes,
and needing to make up for that fact in order to be included. But when they were impure, so anytime their bodies are being women,
be in their bodies, exactly.
They are excluded, and they pose a threat. Their impurity poses a threat to the men around them.
Well, in light of all that, with the notions of impurity, it was assumed that a woman's job really was to bear children and to take care of the house. And this leads us to, of course, the story of Martha and Mary with Jesus.
I love the way that Pagola tells this story. I've never heard it in a way that makes sense. You know, you hear the story and it's like, don't work hard, love Jesus. But we all know you have to work hard anyway, and someone has to do the dishes.
Somebody gotta cook.
It's never made sense to me. But when I read the way Pagola describes it, he says, what Jesus is really doing here when he chastises Martha and praises Mary is he's undermining that cultural assumption that women's place is in the kitchen. He's saying, Martha, you've bought into your own subjugation. Of course, he wouldn't have used those fancy
that's
words.
Interesting, though. Yeah.
But he was saying, that's not your role. Women have every right to be here, sitting and learning from the rabbi, participating in their own intellectual development, learning how to be close to God. That's what God wants from you. He doesn't want you in the kitchen slaving away so that the men can sit out here and learn.
Even when he does talk about stories where she is doing her expected role, the idea of women being included in such stories would be breathtaking, okay?
Yeah.
But he always includes them, whether it's spinning or weaving or baking or putting the yeast in or cleaning up or keeping the kids. They would never have been part of those stories.
Yeah.
But he insisted on it.
Jesus seems to see women as fully human and therefore fully capable of bearing the image of God. So that woman who lost the coin, she can represent God's love for the lost just as much as the man out sowing seed. So his view of women was so radical that I think in some ways it was lost in translation, even among the first disciples. They had to find another way to interpret those parables because he obviously couldn't have meant that women should be included in their own spiritual development.
What's this all about?
So what could he have meant? And whatever he meant, it must apply to men. So I think Pagola really uses the historical situation to help us see how radical Jesus' words and actions actually were.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And I wonder sometimes, this is just my wondering self, of course, in the writings of the scriptures, how much of it, I hope this is not too heretical, how much of it was not actually what Jesus said, but the interpretation down the road? When I used to teach scriptures, one of the things I would insist with my students was, this is not just a story told, this is an interpretation at the same time as it's a story being told. So I think even of, we talked earlier about the woman taken in adultery. How do you take a woman in adultery? They have people staked out just waiting until this happened?
It's
or
difficult.
might this have been a setup in the first place? What do you think?
I think it seems pretty likely that this was all arranged to make Jesus look bad. And the woman was just a pawn.
Oh, she's as usual. The woman is a plaything.
Because people had noticed that Jesus seems to have a different idea of women's place. Jesus is notorious for not condemning people. But the one thing they know he has to condemn someone for is a woman who's adulterous.
Taken in adultery.
Because that's the ultimate disruption of Jewish purity. That is the overthrow of the family.
Oh, sure.
The property system. So he's got to do something.
Well, so if there was obviously a man involved as well, would he have the same consequences as this woman?
What do you think? No.
I think no.
No.
I think he probably would have gotten away with this, or like, don't do that again. Okay.
Yeah, well, his adultery doesn't overthrow the property system or the family.
Oh, that's great.
He's an agent.
That's right. That's very good. Well, and that's kind of interesting when you think of it as property. When in many different societies, we talked about the Roman society, this society, when it came time for a wedding, for instance, a wedding feast, the woman would be all dressed up like a gift with all kinds of bows and everything else, like she's a gift. We're giving you this gift here. Not the guy. He could have worn his Levi's. It wouldn't make any difference. But she had to look just right as well to fulfill what you're talking about.
she's a desirable object that is worth the transfer.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that's a good piece as well. Sometimes she was not worth as much as would like to think, and so you'd have to throw in a couple of cows or a goat or two, maybe a camel, if she was really, you really needed this union.
Yeah, that didn't change for a very long time. We see that in European history, this idea of dowries and a woman as an object for sometimes for purchase and sometimes for advantage, but not generally as a person.
But not as a person.
Yeah.
Well, the last part of this story I always think is just wonderful, where Jesus looks around and says, "Geez, I don't see anybody left around here that's giving you a bad time, Well, go ahead, take off." But then the writer puts in, "and sin no more." Hey, no more, no. Most likely, Bible scholars think that was added, quite some time afterwards, when some scribe was writing this out and thought, "You can't let her get away with this."
Too scandalous. But I think I've got a way that Jesus would have liked us to interpret that, even if as an add-on.
Sure.
Because in this whole story, when is Jesus concerned about the adultery? Never.
Never brings it up.
He's concerned about the woman's humanity, and he's concerned about the crowd's hypocrisy. What he sees as the problem is this system of hypocrisy that prevents community, that's what Jesus comes to bring, is true community. And hypocrisy, you can't be in community, you can't trust, you can't love or relate to hypocrites. So when Jesus says, "Go and sin no more," I think the sin he's talking about to this woman is hypocrisy. Just like in the story of the servant who was forgiven much and then went out and
kicked the other guys around.
Yeah, I think he's telling, this is more the vibe I'm getting from this.
Oh, that's very good.
Those words to the woman.
Oh, I like that a lot. Well, one of the key ingredients, of course, with the whole male-female world at the time, and in some ways right down to our present, is that a woman always had to be protected. She was not trusted. The other men in the world were certainly not trusted. So she always had to be protected in some manner, whether it was her father or her husband, or if both of those should die, it could go down to any number of other males within the family.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the property system. Women are property, and men have to defend their property. If a woman goes out on her own and she is violated, which is the assumption, they almost assume if she's gone out on her own, she must have willingly or unwillingly been sexually violated.
Sure.
And it's her fault.
Of course it's her fault, yeah.
And so...
It's all temptation. Men can't be expected to fight off these temptations.
No, if a woman is on her own, she's free game.
There you go.
So, so women who, because they were widows and maybe didn't have a relative, or for some reason maybe they were being abused, who knows?
Sure.
Lots of reasons a woman could be out on her own. They were just assumed to be prostitutes. So we see that with Mary Magdalene.
Oh, tell us about Magdalene.
So she was mentally ill. Jesus heals her. But culturally and traditionally, that her independence, so she's following Jesus as a single woman who's been healed, clearly she must have been a prostitute.
Yeah.
So if we look through the history of art and the church teaching on her, she's a woman of ill repute.
Ill repute. Which
just comes from her not belonging to someone.
And there's absolutely no indication of this whatsoever within the Magdalene stories. Well, who in the world would have concocted these stories of her as a prostitute?
Well, again, it's not that these cultural assumptions ended in the time of Jesus. These cultural assumptions persist even today. I mean, we see this like with the issue of campus sexual assault. Women are still being blamed for, well, you were walking alone at night and you were wearing a skirt, so clearly. So, I mean, not to bring too much into it, but it's not that these cultural assumptions ended then. So these stories about Mary Magdalene following Jesus and being unassociated with a man, well, she could only do that if she had been a prostitute, and it's unclear that she ever really, I mean, she does follow Jesus, but did she reform because she kept being on her own? I think people continued to be uncomfortable with the notion of a woman, even one of his closest disciples, who didn't belong to a man.
But the same thing applied to men. As a young man, Jesus would fall into this trap sometimes as well. You were expected by the time you were an adult to marry, to have a woman that you're going to marry, and that you're going to raise children. So if you didn't fall into that camp, you even as a man could be in trouble. Not as much trouble as a woman, but that's possible as well.
Yeah, I mean, you almost feel sorry for the gospel writers trying to make this culturally acceptable.
Yes, very much.
We have this leader that we know is the face of God, but he did crazy things. He's telling us that women can be included and men don't have to own other people. And the goal of being human isn't to be the top of the pyramid, the head of the table. He's pointing out we're supposed to go to the bottom of the table. And I think that's the biggest struggle with the message of Christ, is the idea that communion, God is seeking a communion that includes everyone, where nobody is the top of the heap, nobody gets to own, no one gets to control, where being the leader, that in persona Christi, means you don't try and rule over anyone or direct anyone. Your only job is to include. And I think that's the biggest struggle, moral struggle for all of us. I mean, that temptation to try and fix problems by getting control rather than just accept that we're loved.
Letting it be what it is, and to accept that we're loved. Okay, now look. Part of the goal of this series is to identify things like the relationship of Jesus with women, and then to see how might this have occurred within the human Homo sapiens evolutionary process. As a moral theology teacher, for instance, how would you address that? How would you address the concept that somewhere in the long history of Homo sapiens, and we talked about this actually in one of the very first of the series that we're doing right now, Homo sapiens as such broke off, well, as hominins 5 million years ago, came down to about 250,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens would have looked pretty much like we look. But the turning point was language. With language, no longer were you just responsible for your little family and your little clan. Now, for the first time, over a long period of time, you could begin to communicate. And you could communicate on a wider scale. But don't we find, I'm leading a little bit on this, but don't we find that some of the very traits that would have existed in a pre-linguistic society, even though we're talking about beings that are just pretty darn near the same as we, are there traits in there that would in fact have found their way through societies, through different teachers, all the rest, into things like modern ethical problems or situations that this is good or this is not good?
Yeah, I think if you look at animals, so,
Sure.
chimps or monkeys,
We're all part of the great apes.
Yeah, even dogs, so it doesn't even have to be that intelligent of an animal. You have these two warring things, and of course the chimps, it's clear. This part of this capacity to love, to genuinely love and include the others, to be part of my group, and this desire to dominate. And I think those two things come up throughout human evolution, throughout human culture, human religions, these impulses. And I think going back to that question you asked me at the beginning about my students and how did they take this idea of moral change, I think there are people who, for whatever reason, that idea of a dominant leader who makes everything the way it is, who includes some people and excludes others, is comforting. It's stabilizing.
Oh my gosh.
And if we can identify problems on the outside, women are a problem, immorality is a problem, the Philistines are a problem, whoever it is in whatever time,
Sure.
and our leader protects us from that problem, well, then we'll make whatever sacrifice, and including and up to love and communion for stability and safety. And I think what Jesus is constantly doing that is so frustrating for all of us still, and certainly the people who saw him there, is presenting us with a vision of the opposite. We have this innate capacity to include and to love, and that casts out fear. Once you set in your mind, I'm going to include even the dangerous people, the dirty people, the scary people, the strange people, then you don't need someone to protect you from them. Mm-hmm. The leader's job is to show you how to include them, to bring them in.
Wow.
And this idea that Jesus says, like, this is the kingdom of heaven, a meal where women are here, a meal where foreigners are here, where tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees, and we're not fighting over who gets to sit at the head of the table. Mm-hmm. We're just enjoying each other's company, and that's the kingdom of heaven. I think he's pointing us to that capacity that we have from our evolutionary, our ancestors. You have the capacity to love, to live without fear. But it takes courage, more courage than surrendering your agency and subordinating other people.
That's good, yeah. Well, you mentioned a number of times the idea of fear. Mm-hmm. It's been one of my contentions, as though it were mine, for a very long time, that fear may be the motivating factor behind the vast majority of human life and thought and actions and evolution.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like, when we have that sense that there is a threat to our life or the lives of those we love, and when I say life, that can even mean purity, the possibility of inclusion in whatever we see as the religious goal of life. Having our children go to hell is a threat. That's a terrifying.
That's terrifying, yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to do what we can to protect them. I think that's basic instinct, that's normal, and in some cases that's positive. The problem comes in when it's not a real threat, or when we assign that threat to a scapegoat. So if we're afraid my child is not doing what I want, my child is not growing, they're being threatened by all these outside influences, well, I could look at myself and say, what is this bond of love that I have with my child? Why are they feeling they need to go out and find another way to live? Instead of doing that, we look and say, it's those people's fault.
Somebody else's fault.
It's that bad influence over there, and we should make it illegal, or we should kill them, or, depending on what culture you're in at what time.
What I'd like to do, as we wrap ourselves together here, what do you think, in referring back, for instance, to Jesus coming right out of the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle down to him, what do you think, taking all those various kinds of traditions together, all of whom are moralists and ethicists in some way or other? Socrates, know yourself, you got to know who you are. To Jesus himself, I would posit that perhaps he is the most important ethical figure in Western civilization. Okay, certainly not globally, but in Western civilization. How would you put him in the whole concept of who we are, who we have become in this process of supposedly becoming more moral?
It's a great question. I think first looking at the core of who Jesus is, like what does he represent in humanity, and what does he represent in terms of the ultimate order, what we're called to. And it's hard for me to see it as anything but this radical inclusion. Inclusion to the point it kills you, literally.
Yeah.
And we see this with women, but we see it all across the board. Children, the sick, the lame, everyone who was excluded, he made a point to include. And I think...
And most often without blaming.
Yeah, just including. Come, have a drink.
Yeah. And when it was blaming, it was like you said earlier, it was hypocrisy.
Yeah. If you're preventing community, then he gets mad. But he'll still include you. He's not going to throw you out. He's still eating with the Pharisees. And I think if we look at today, that's so essential. I mean, the history of Christianity is a history of people using Jesus, putting a cross on their shield or their sword or their AK-47 and using it to exclude people. Yeah. But we always have the opportunity, every single moment we can include. And it goes on the right, on the left. Here we have an election coming up and everybody has passionate feelings. But when we let those feelings say, like, I see you as a liberal, not my friend, or not a person, or I see you as a conservative, not someone who has needs and dreams just like I do, then it doesn't matter how right our beliefs are. Yeah. I think that's what Jesus is pointing out. It doesn't matter how right you are. It matters how loving you are.
That's just great. That's really wonderful. Katie, I cannot thank you enough for being with us today.
Thank you.
This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Can I call on you again to do similar things?
Anytime.
I love that part. And thanks to all of you for being with us again today as we continue to dive into this series on the evolutionary factors involved in morality, in ethics, in proper behavior and whatnot. Thank you, and of course, blessings always.